Hello, friends. My name is Yogesh Patel, and this podcast focuses on bullying, self-awareness, and our inner spirit, inviting high-profile guests to share their experiences on these various topics. It is my absolute honor and thrill to have Luke Russert, famed Emmy award-winning journalist and New York Times best-selling author, as my first guest. In 2023, Luke penned this book, Look for Me There, Serving My Father, Finding Myself. In summary, what this book is about, reading from the front flap here, what began as several open-ended months of travel to decompress and reassess morphed into a 3+ year odyssey across 6 continents to discover the world and ultimately to find himself. Luke, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And on that note, what made you decide to say yes? I'm curious.
To your show?
Yes, the inaugural podcast.
Oh, well, I think that you're touching in on what's a very important concept, and that's interior spiritual growth. And that's something that there's so many, there's a lot of things out there about it. But I think, honing in on how that's not an exclusive thing, that it's applicable to everybody if you're willing to take that journey inside. And that's something I really encourage people to do. I think some folks, they really want to do that self-discovery and that self-examination, almost a diagnostic test on themselves and go into the different layers of their being. But oftentimes they're afraid to start. And oftentimes it's awkward. And oftentimes it's uncomfortable. So once you started to pull back those layers a little bit, you get to a feeling of feeling more whole. So anything you can do to help people discover that is a good thing. And so good on you to do an entire podcast dedicated to it, for sure.
Thank you. I'm grateful for those words. And actually, on the diagnostic part, one of the most powerful sentences in the book you write, Luke, is, I need not to constantly look to others for guidance. I need to start noticing the voice within. What were those inner voices telling you?
That's a great question. I think oftentimes we live in a society where you're always supposed to be aware of what is next. And you hit certain benchmarks, whether it's age, whether it's education, whether it's job, and you can enjoy that moment, but it's very fleeting because then you have to go to, well, what's next? And the thing I joke about is I talk to friends and the first thing they talk about is, oh, I just had a child. Well, they have to get into this preschool, and then that middle school, and then that high school, and then that college. And I joke, and are you to start researching nursing homes later on? I mean, at what point does it stop? So I think what I came to realize was that for a long time, I wasn't necessarily, I think, overcome with those voices, but I think that I probably paid them too much attention. That I always was thinking, hey, I should seek to be like everybody else, or what everybody else is abiding by this path, and that's the one that makes the most sense. Then I started to think, well, why don't I feel necessarily the way that people in my cohort do, or that people I interact with a lot do, about where life is headed and what we value in life? I feel about things differently. I feel that I've missed out a lot on growth experiences because I have not traveled. I feel like I have not immersed myself in different aspects of culture, which could make me a better, more well-rounded person. And once I started listening to those voices in my head, and I wasn't so scared of them, that it was okay to be different in a way, or okay just to think differently, that life started to open up more for me. But it's hard to get there because when you're in an environment that is a bubble and people think a certain way and there's different measures of success, and if you don't hit them, you're a sort of vagabond hippie, right? Then it's not the easiest thing to do. You gotta have to have thick skin for a little period of time.
It reminds me of the British poet and philosopher Aldous Huxley, who wrote the book Brave New World. The theme is about knowing thyself. That's his main theme, know thyself. And one of the quotes that he writes is, if most of us remain ignorant of ourselves, it is because self-knowledge is painful and we prefer the pleasures of illusion. What do you make of that sentence?
The pleasures of illusion that would be the trap, right? That's the sort of
Yeah, yeah,
trap that we fall into to a degree. And there's comfort there, and there's comfort in thinking in sort of something that doesn't challenge you. And there's comfort in thinking in something that doesn't scare you. And I think so many people do fall into that pleasure of illusion. I also think that if you deconstruct that, who sets up the pleasure of illusion? Is it society?
yourself.
Is it yourself? Right?
Oh,
And
yeah,
but
yeah,
no, that's the question. And I think that it's being curious about those things that I think opens up a lot of doors, which people should act upon.
the self-awareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
because I think one of the things that I learned through travel was twofold: is the self awareness can come from how you're measuring yourself up against the world and different cultures that you're experiencing. Because when you're in a place where you don't know the language, nobody knows who you are, you don't
right.
know anybody. You have to go back and say, all right, what am I offering here? What can I do to communicate?
Hmm.
What can I do to be? But then I would explore that out as I think a lot of people don't have that curiosity, or it isn't uncomfortable to them, or think that there's only one way to go about doing things. And once you shed those layers and you open yourself up to other ways, it's easier not to fall into that trap that the life
Right.
plan you're on is the only one that exists, or the bubble that you exist in is the only thing there. Anything you can do to break away from that is very important. But to expand more on the quote, the pleasures of illusion, it's almost to some degree, it's there's this desire not to rock the boat, right?
Sure.
And
Yep.
it's uncomfortable to force yourself to do that, to rock the boat a little bit.
And that bleeds into my next question, Luke, and that is, again, the book serves as great reminders and perspectives for adults. But again, I think you've touched upon this, but answering it in a different way, how would this book and its messaging connect to adolescents and young adults who are trying to find their own identity?
It's a great question. I think for the American existence, you seek to figure out what your identity is, because now it seems to be with social media, it's sort of defined in how you push yourself out there.
Right.
And the kid, and there's these snapshots in time of you that seem to sort of live forever now. I often joke with my friends, we were right on the cusp. Facebook came out when we were in college, and we were so thankful it wasn't around in high school, because if we were forever defined by how we were when we were
Oh
15
yeah.
years old, God
Yep.
save us. I think, though, what the book hones in on in terms of identity is really trying to take measure of the world before you and notice things. And noticing things sounds so simple, but oftentimes it's so difficult. And the reason why it's so
Right.
difficult is because you're immersed in your own world. And so one of the
Sure.
exercises I try to do with people, I say, what can you do to enlighten your perceptions, heighten your perceptions? Sort of, what do you
Right.
perceive when you walk into a room? What do you notice? Why is
Yes.
that man speaking in the way that he does? Why is that lady dressed the way she is dressed? What's going on? What is about this environment that might lead people to act in a certain way, or that you're picking up on? What is the energy that you pick up on in a place like this? And
Hmm.
I think having that type of perception allows one to then start to take the questions they ask about the environment around them and then bring those in internally. And that's
Can kids understand that?
I do think so. Yes, I think that what they can start to
Yeah.
see is
Yeah.
once they begin to pay attention to the environment, then they can look at their own place within the
Right.
environment. Sadly, now, I think because so much happens on screens and is so curated on social media, the environment is a digital one. And what
Sure.
does that really mean? Right. And I think that's sort of something to explore. And so I think part of the strength of my book and my journey was that I really tried to immerse myself in real tangible, physical culture and space and beauty and environment. And there's so many
Right.
gifts to come from that. And if we're going really deep, you'd say That's why the cavemen painted paintings in the cave, right? To give themselves sort of a sense of life and be aware of their
Yeah.
environment. Yeah.
And speaking of, well, the cave example, um, there are many themes of gratitude sprinkled in the book from your travels. How is gratitude expressed differently in these different cultures?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So, in some cultures, especially I've found in Latin America, especially men are very vocal. They're very affectionate. They will, if they're happy about something, you know right away. If they're upset about something, you know right away. So one of the things I
Right.
really noticed, especially in Latin America, was if I were to do a nice gesture, there would be a real upfront sort of thank you. You really appreciate it. When I was more in Asian cultures, it was more reserved. You would see gratitude come through as a sort of, to some degree, an expectation of being a good person. But then also,
Right.
if there was niceties, it was like, okay, don't overdo it. Like, I appreciate it. It's nice, right? And whatnot. So you see that. But I think the most interesting common connective tissue would be that of faith, and how deeply
Hmm.
pious spiritual people, whether they're Christians or Islam or Judaism or Hindu or Buddhism or whatever faith is out there, you really
Right.
do see a sense of gratitude and deep faith and a real sense of calm and inner peace. And that's what I noticed. And so if I had a gratitude for anything, and I think there's a sort of universal gratitude, it's for that calmness and inner peace that
Yeah.
comes from faith and comfort in oneself and in one's world.
That's an extension to your support system that you have amongst your friends and family. Faith, I think, is
Absolutely.
is, is an integral pillar to that. Um, Luke, not only is this book grieving about your father, I came away very fascinated by the relationship to your mother. Again, being very vulnerable, describing both the resentment and unconditional love you have for her. And I just want to read another excerpt from the book, which you write. It's kind of funny, Mom. Most parents would be terrified of their kid trying to sneak into Bolivia, but you're all for it. She replies, "You won't get anywhere in life just sitting on the sidelines." Her eyes meet mine. "You can do it." Then you write, "I've never seen her put so much faith in me. I fight back tears." Could you describe that moment?
Sure. I had traveled with my mom around a few countries in Latin America. We had gone to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And I was ready
Yeah,
to go to Bolivia by myself. And my mother was a Peace Corps volunteer in Colombia in the 1960s. And she did that really because at that time, when she graduated from college, women were kind of forced into these roles as paralegals or teachers or flight attendants. And she really wanted to do something else. She wanted to do something with
right,
a sense of independence. And that trip that you're referencing was the first time I had ever gone with my mom on an overnight trip. I think in my life, since I was a very young kid, and I had gone on a lot of trips with my father, and so this was the first time we really
right.
traveled together, which I regret it being that amount of time. But what I learned traveling with her over the course of those weeks was, here was somebody who was very tenacious, who spoke truth to power, and who was fearless. And when I say fearless, was
Hmm.
not afraid to throw herself in situations because she felt, A, she could measure herself up against the world, but B, that's where she would
Right,
learn the most, not only about other people, but herself. And so when I'm talking about getting into Bolivia, for her, it's you got to go do this experience, but it's also, show what you're made of. You come from this kind of coddled bubble, if you will, of Washington D.C. You grew up in politics. Like, what can you
sure.
do? And yeah, it's a pretty badass way of parenting, and I'm thankful for it. But I think in that moment, it was it was probably the first time where I ever felt like she saw a lot of herself in me. And to expand upon
That's
that,
interesting.
I think to expand upon that, one of the things I write about, which I think we all do at some point in our lives, is we begin to see our parents as mortals. We see them independent of mom or independent of
Yeah,
dad.
you're right.
Who was
Yep.
Maureen? Who was Tim? And I think in that trip, Maureen really came out, and I got to see, all her strengths, all her flaws, everything put in. And it wasn't just mom nagging me about something. Is, all right, who is this person? And getting to know this
Sure.
person. And once I was able to do that and sort of see who she was, our relationship improved. It was always decent, but
Is
it
that what
got
the
to the
tears were
point of
about?
real. Pardon?
Is that what the tears were about?
I think the tears were about the fact that it had taken so much time, but also it almost did feel a little bit of, I seeing her seeing a little bit of herself in me, and I don't think I had ever felt
Sure.
that until that age, until that moment. And I think there's a sense of pride as a son that you feel in that
Yes. Yep.
moment.
Yeah. It's the dutiful son, or dutiful, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
No. For
No.
sure.
No.
And it almost feels like it's a sense of recognition for it, and you're like, okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yes. It's as parents that cast long shadows, I can certainly attest.
Mm-hmm.
Totally understand that. Um, I've been certainly very grateful of our conversation.
Well,
Thank you
thanks
for
for
your
having
time.
me. No, I mean, I
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed our conversation, and good luck.
Thank
And
you.
this is fascinating.
And I hope that you can come back again to share some valuable updates.
I'd like to. Hopefully, I have something
Sounds
else
good.
written at some point.